Democritus, the ancient Greek invention of the atom. Starting from the 6th century BC, the Greek philosophers started to explain the world not by appealing to the gods, but by assuming that everything is made of simple elements that are governed by naturalistic mechanisms. The first of these natural philosophers was Thales. He claimed that everything in the world is ultimately made of water. Soon others followed. Some claimed the essential element of the universe was fire, others said air, and yet others believed everything is made of numbers. Leucippus and his student Democritus developed yet another theory, claiming that literally everything is made of atomos, meaning uncuttable. These atoms, they said, can bounce off each other and can get stuck together, forming all the phenomena we see around us in the world. Democritus assumed these atoms to be infinite in number, and as a result they also formed infinite worlds, all through random chance, and some of these worlds contained life, while others did not. Sensory experiences too, they claimed, including our experience of color, taste and sound, are caused by the impacts of atoms on our senses. And even the soul, according to Democritus, is made of atoms and will therefore not survive death, a shocking conclusion at the time. And visions and dreams, he said, are caused by films of fine atoms emitted by all objects, and these atoms can be detected by our mind. And as the films of different objects might accidentally mix mid-flight, this can cause us to see fantastical mythical beasts, giving a rational explanation for mythology. Curiously, however, Democritus did allow for the existence of gods, but they too, he claimed, are made of atoms, and therefore not immortal. The atomist Epicurus a few centuries later went even further, when he placed these gods outside of our world, in the void between worlds, and he claimed that these gods were unaware of the existence of human beings. And as a result of these ideas, his fellow Athenians accused Epicurus of atheism, which was an insult at the time. Finally, we'll mention Lucretius, the great Roman atomist and poet. He noticed that dust particles, when seen in sunlight, move around erratically, in all directions, which he believed was caused by the impact of many atoms bumping that dust particle around. And bizarrely, this exact motion, called Brownian motion, was 2000 years later used by Einstein, Albert Einstein, to definitively prove the existence of atoms. So we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. The first natural philosophy was developed by Thales in the early 6th century BC. He became the first of what are now called the pre-Socratic philosophers. That is, the philosophers who came before the eminent philosopher Socrates. But this name does them little justice. And as a result, I prefer Aristotle's term, who referred to them as physiologoi, or natural philosophers. And he distinguished them from the earlier theologoi, or theologians, and mythologoi, or storytellers. For both of these groups attributed many of the natural phenomena to the gods, while the physiologoi sought natural explanations alone. Thales developed a belief still central to modern science, namely that despite the wide variety of phenomena around us, the universe is in its essence a very orderly place that operates on a few basic, naturalistic mechanisms. And although this was a genius idea, Thales's execution of these principles was rather simplistic. He observed that water existed as a solid, a liquid and a gas, and he noticed that water is essential for life. And from these observations he erroneously concluded that, quote, everything is made of water. Soon different theories sprang up. For Anaximenes, a generation later, the base element of the universe is air, as he saw that air could condense into water, for instance into dewdrops, while of course we now know that it is actually water vapor in the air that condenses into water. And then we have Heraclitus. For him the essential element was fire, since like fire, he said, everything in the universe is in a constant process of change. Empedocles in the 5th century tried to unify a number of these theories, and he concluded that the universe was built up of 4 elements: water, fire, earth and air, and that mixing these elements created the complexity of the phenomena we see in the world around us. And this became a quite successful theory. Also in the 5th century, the philosophers Leucippus and his pupil Democritus added atomism to the list. They believed that if you keep cutting a material into smaller parts, you should theoretically end up with a particle that cannot be cut any further. And a cut or section in Greek is tomos, and as a result these uncuttable particles became known as atomos, or uncuttable. And since they cannot be cut, Democritus added, they must also be indestructible and therefore eternal. And since we cannot see atoms in our daily lives, they must be so small that they cannot be observed individually, but only if a large bunch of them are grouped together. Aristotle said they are, quote, so small as to escape our senses. Before we go in depth into Greek atomism, let's first give a quick overview of the lives of Leucippus and Democritus. We know almost nothing about the life of Leucippus, and in fact neither did the ancient Greeks, for they could tell almost nothing about him and they even disagreed about his birthplace. Aristotle and others did name him as the founder of the atomic theory, yet the important atomist Epicurus even denied that he existed. So he's clearly a very shadowy figure in history. We also know almost nothing about his work, except that a later writer claimed that he wrote a book called On Mind, and his writer even quotes one line from the book, which is in fact Leucippus's only extant quote. We read, "Nothing happens in vain, but everything from reason and by necessity." And this quote beautifully shows the deterministic worldview of the atomists. And finally, Theophrastus mentions that he wrote the book The Great World System, but this is a bit strange because this work is usually attributed by other authors to Democritus. And this is about all we know about Leucippus. We know a little bit more about Democritus. He was born in Abdera. He was 1 year older than Socrates, and he traveled widely. And we read that he got very old, according to some sources over 100 years old. And we also read that he laughed often, holding all human affairs to be laughable. He was even nicknamed the Laugher. Comically, we also read that he once visited Athens, but that no one knew him. In one of the direct quotes that we have of him, he said, "For I came to Athens and no one knew me." Democritus is also said to have written a large amount of works, but none of them survive, unfortunately. All we have are a few fragments here and there, preserved by later authors, and of these fragments of his works, only 7 of them actually deal with natural philosophy. But luckily a number of authors, most notably Aristotle, did write extensively about his theories. We do have a list of his work, recorded by Diogenes Laertius. He states that his most important work was his Great World System, or Megas Diakospos, and then goes through the entire list. On ethics, he wrote the works Pythagoras, The Disposition of the Sage, The Things in Hades, and On the Goodness of Man. His scientific works included the Lesser World System, Description of the World, on the planets, on nature, on the nature of man, on the mind, on the senses, on tastes, on color, on different shapes, on changes of shape, on images, a canon of logic, celestial causes, causes in the air, terrestrial causes, causes of fire and of things in fire, causes of sounds, causes of seeds, plants and fruits, causes of animals on the stone, the great year of astronomy, a calendar, the contest of the water clock, descriptions of the heaven, descriptions of the earth, descriptions of the poles, the description of rays, on diet, medical opinion, on agriculture, on land measurements. It goes on and on. His biological works, we read, included an account of how spiders spin their webs, and also an erroneous account of how the horns of animals form. He believed that animals originally formed out of slime, and he believed that semen originates in all parts of the body, which explained why children get all the same body parts of the parent. On top of all this, he also wrote various mathematical works. They are called On Differences of Judgment or On the Contact of Circle and Sphere. He wrote a book on geometry, a work on numbers, on irrational lines and solids, and on things unfolded. And the great mathematician Archimedes reported that he discovered, without giving a proof, that the volume of a cone is 1/3 of the volume of a cylinder with the same base. Quite a significant discovery. Democritus even wrote on art, a work on rhythm and melody, on poetry, on beauty of diction and on painting. And finally, tactics and use of arms, causes of suitable and unsuitable times, on the sacred writings in Babylon, voyages round the ocean, on history, a Chaldean treatise, a Phrygian treatise, and the causes of laws. An insanely large collection of which nothing remains, unfortunately. Finally, I want to mention that Democritus, quote, traveled to Egypt to learn geometry from the priests, and to Persia to the Chaldeans. And later Greek writers added to this list, quote, and some say that he associated with the naked sages or the gymnosophistae of India. It seems, by the way, given these accounts, that most of the pre-Socratic philosophers traveled widely, but all the way to India seems unlikely to most modern historians. And by the way, these accounts of travel to India all came later, long after Alexander the Great invaded India and met some of these naked sages. So the travels of these pre-Socratic philosophers to India is likely a later fabrication. Now, let's discuss the atoms. Democritus started with a concept from the influential philosopher Parmenides, who claimed that things cannot come into being from nothing, and even curiously that things cannot change from one being into another. That is, he claimed that being itself is eternal and unchanging, which doesn't make a lot of sense, given that the world around us is constantly changing. But Parmenides famously thought that all this change was an illusion. Democritus didn't want to go that far, but in line with these ideas, he claimed that atoms were unchanging and eternal. And because these atoms can combine in different ways, he didn't need to follow Parmenides' bizarre idea that every change is an illusion. He said that every individual atom is eternal and unchanging, but they could combine into different formations and separate again, explaining our sensory experience that the world is constantly changing. Democritus also claimed that these atoms could have different shapes, and they could cluster together based on these shapes. They might be either polished or rough, round or pointed, hooked or twisted or bent. He also claimed that the number of atoms was infinite, and with infinite atoms in an infinite universe, there must be an infinite number of worlds. And some of these worlds, he claims, developed life while others did not. Or in the words of Hippolytus, quote, there are infinitely many worlds differing in size, some with neither sun nor moon, some with sun and moon, some with a sun and a moon larger than ours, and some with more. And there are worlds without animals or plants or any moisture. The motion and the positions of the atoms, Democritus claimed, are fully determined by prior collisions, through simple cause and effect. And this idea is in accord with that single line that we have of Leucippus. I'll read it again. Nothing happens in vain, but everything from reason and by necessity. All is deterministic bouncing of atoms. Pseudo-Plutarch also said it beautifully. He said, Democritus said that necessity is impact and motion, and a blow of matter. Shockingly, the atomist also believed that with an eternal universe there can be no beginning, so this causal chain of collisions had to extend back infinitely. Sometimes Democritus described this endless motion and bouncing of atoms as random or based on chance, or taiki in Greek. But chance here doesn't seem to imply true randomness, as we have seen, the universe was deterministic. Instead, it likely meant that the motion was not preordained or ordered, and that the motion was without purpose. Simplicius explained about this, quote, the ancient theory that denies chance seemed to refer to Democritus, for although he appears to have made use of chance in his theory of the formation of the world, in his more detailed discussions he says that chance is not a cause of anything. And Lactantius distinguished between theories in which, quote, there is a providence which looks after everything, and in which whether everything happens comes about fortuitously. And then he says, the latter opinion was introduced by Democritus and upheld by Epicurus. To explain how two atoms can be separate from each other and how they can move, Democritus also postulated the void, which he described as nothing, or what is not. Interestingly, he could also have used the word space. Space was needed for the atoms to move in, and for them to exist apart from each other. But that seems to be an abstraction too far for the time. Then Democritus set out to explain the world of the senses. One of his direct quotes reads, bitter and sweet are opinions. Color is an opinion. In truth, there are only atoms and the void. That is, sensory experiences are just conjured up by the mind, while in fact all there is bouncing atoms. We read that while atoms, quote, exist by their nature, these sensory properties only exist by convention. And Galen writes, indeed color is only by convention. By convention is the sweet, by convention is the bitter. And in fact, there are only atoms and the void, as Democritus assures us. It is the encounter of atoms that produces all the sensory qualities for us to experience. While nothing is by nature white, black, yellow, red, bitter or sweet. That is all in the mind. Democritus claimed, for instance, that objects emit films of atoms, which he named images or eidola. And when these eidola enter the eye, we can see the objects. And when the eidola enter our nose, we can smell them. And the shape and size of the atoms determine the smell or color. So curiously, vision, according to Democritus, was not caused by light reflecting off objects and entering our eyes, but by these eidola of atoms continuously emitted by all objects. The only role in his theory for the sun was to brighten the objects, which allowed them to become visible in the first place. And the light was also said to condense the air, making vision easier. A very curious theory. But the theory worked quite well, although there was a problem. To avoid the implication that objects continually decrease in size because of the endless emission of eidola, Democritus added that they also gain atoms when the eidola of different objects clash into them. Now to flavor. Democritus also assigned different atomic shapes to various flavors. Let's go through some examples. He makes sweet round and of a good size. Sour is large, rough and polygonal. Sharp tasting, as the name implies, is sharp, pointed, bent and fine. Salty is pointed and of good size, crooked and isosceles. Bitter is round and smooth, with crookedness and small size. Oily is fine, round and small, etc. Now we move to the more esoteric part of Democritus's philosophy, including a theory of the soul and the gods. The belief that literally everything consists only of atoms and the void also had serious consequences for the religion of Democritus. First of all, he believed the soul was also made of atoms, namely fine and round atoms that can penetrate the whole body and cause it to move. But since our body disintegrates after death, this must also be true of the soul. So for Democritus there was no afterlife, and later Epicurus claimed that this removed the fear of death and the fear of hell, for if we disintegrate, nothing happens to us. Democritus also believed that myth was based on misinterpretation. According to Sextus Empiricus, Democritus believed in the natural origin of religious belief. He writes, "Some have supposed that the notion of the gods was inspired in us by awesome events encountered in the world, and such appears to be Democritus's thesis. When, proclaims he, the ancient witnessed events, of which the heavens are the theatre, like thunder, lightning, thunderbolts, the conjunction of celestial bodies, or the eclipses of sun and moon, their fright made them believe that certain gods were responsible." And Clement writes about Democritus. Democritus says that a few learned people, raising their hands toward what the Greeks now call the air, said, quote, "Zeus thinks of all things, and he knows all things, and he gives and takes away, and he is the king of all things." So here he even says that Zeus is just a misinterpretation of the air. Democritus also believed that some of these idola, these images, are made of superfine atoms that could not be seen by the senses, but that could penetrate our body and become visible to our mind, and then appear as imagination, visions and dreams. And Lucretius, the Roman atomist, made this idea more explicit, claiming that visions and strange mythological beings can be explained by idola colliding with each other. He said, "First I say this, myriad idola of all different sorts roam about in all directions, on all sides. Tenuous images which, when they come together, fuse effortlessly in the air, one unto another. They are of a much finer texture than the idola that strike the eye, and they elicit vision where they penetrate to the pores of the body to stir the subtle substance of the spirit. Thus are we able to see centaurs, the body of Scylla, or the head of Cerberus, or the likeness of the dead, whose bones are covered with earth, because all manner of idola are carried here and there. For quite obviously it is not from a living being that the image of a centaur comes, since such a beast never existed. But it is the image of a horse and that of a man coming together by chance." Quite a cool theory. Democritus also added that the idola of people can also possess the psychological traits of the people who emit them. And in this way, idola can be benevolent or wicked, depending on the person who emits them. But, and now comes an interesting part, these ideas didn't mean that Democritus didn't believe in the divine at all, for he believed in atomic gods. And these gods, he said, could live for a long time, but they were not immortal, as they too were made of atoms. Strangely, he writes that the gods are living idola, and not beings who emit idolas themselves. The gods are a specific type of living idola. Very curious. I do have to say that Democritus's gods only played a small role, for they did not create the universe, they did not order it, since the universe formed by the random bouncing of atoms. But we can see the gods, their idola, in dream when they pass through us. And Democritus also believed that these idola gods could be harmful or beneficial, and that they can foretell the future by talking to humans, and that prayer can be useful to meet only the good idola and not the bad ones. So there was clearly some religious superstition left in Democritus. His most important follower, Epicurus, however, made the gods even less significant, for which he was often accused of atheism. He even claimed that the gods had no concern at all for human affairs, and that they didn't even know humans existed. And as a result, he said, rituals and prayer were of no use at all. And why the god Idola of Democritus were amongst us in this world, Epicurus placed the gods outside of our world, in the metacosmia, or what in Latin became the intermundia, the place between worlds. For there, he claimed, the gods are free from most of the collisions that we experience in the world, and this allowed them to live longer. And the only evidence we have of these gods, according to Epicurus, are the Idola that these gods emit. In Epicurus' case, the gods aren't the Idola themselves, but they emit Idola. And these Idola can pass through space and reach the earth, and then they can be dimly seen by the mind. And by the way, a strange thought, since these gods can lose these Idola all the time, they lose a lot of atoms. And we read mysteriously that these atoms are replenished by streams of atoms flowing their way. And you can decide for yourself how that might work, I have no idea. Now let's move to the formation of our world, which was worked out by Epicurus. Democritus only gave his atoms the property shape and size, but Epicurus added weight, and we'll see why in a second. Democritus had no need for weight, likely because he believed that weight could also be explained by the collisions of particles. Epicurus, however, needed weight to explain why atoms move in the first place. He believed that due to their weight, atoms in their natural state move downward, all in parallel straight lines with constant velocity through infinite space. And this idea, by the way, of a natural state of atoms was a reaction to Aristotle's idea that all objects move either according to their own inherent natural motion, or they are forced by external impact. But Epicurus then realized that if all atoms move perfectly downward, they would never collide, they would all move downward, parallel to each other. To solve this, he added that the atoms sometimes made small random sideway motions that allowed them to interact. Cicero explained about this. Epicurus considers that atoms are carried by their own weight in a straight line towards the bottom, this motion being natural to all physical bodies. That is gravity. But when this penetrating mind, that is Epicurus, realized that if all atoms always moved downward along a straight line, they would never touch each other. So he invoked the fantasy that they experience an imperceptible sideways declination, which enables them to embrace and cling together, and this is how the world is formed. And this swerve to the side, by the way, Epicurus claimed, also allowed for free will in the world, for otherwise the world would be fully deterministic, which Epicurus wanted to avoid. We now continue Cicero's account. Seeing that if atoms proceeded towards the bottom under their own weight, we would be deprived of all freedom, since their movement would be preordained and necessary, Epicurus imagined, in order to free himself from this necessity, a means that had evidently escaped Democritus. He claimed that while in straight line motion towards the bottom, imposed by their own weight and gravity, they deviate slightly to the side. These atoms, we then read, congregate together and form a single swirl, and these swirls are already mentioned by Democritus. And he said about them that in these swirls the small atoms are pushed to the outer regions, while, quote, the rest remain and become entangled with one another. They move around together, making up a primary spherical structure, and in this way the earth came into being. In most accounts, however, Democritus believed in a disc-shaped earth, and we read that it initially was in motion, but it finally came to rest when it became heavier and heavier. And in some accounts we read that this disk floated on compressed air beneath it. And then those smaller atoms which were pressed out eventually, quote, caught fire and constitute the nature of the stars. All the heavenly bodies are set alight by the speed of their motion. After reading all this, I was surprised Democritus didn't give a list of examples of how atoms could explain various phenomena around us. For this would count as sort of proto-evidence for the existence of atoms. For instance, I at least expected an explanation of the phases of water, for instance, with perhaps ice having a higher density than water vapor. But the best I could find in this case was a vague description that, quote, rarity and density could be explained by the amount of void in matter, without any particular examples. Or I expected to mention that we can feel atoms of the air bounce into our hands when we quickly move them. Do this yourself and you'll feel them right now. But perhaps those explanations once existed in his many works, but even the fact that they weren't preserved is telling. As always, the early Greeks were more concerned with philosophical speculation than with actually proving their theories with evidence. After a long search, I did find in Theophrastus that, quote, iron is harder and heavier than lead, for iron is irregularly constituted, with large empty spaces in many places. This is a cool explanation for differences in density. And Seneca writes that Democritus believed that bronze can hold heat well because it has very small pores which release heat very slowly. Also an interesting, though faulty explanation. The later Epicurus and Lucretius did somewhat better. Epicurus wrote about solids. Hard and compact bodies must have crooked atoms, more intimately linked and intertwined, like branches of a tree. And Lucretius added, a liquid, being a fluid body, can only be made of smooth and spherical parts, and gases such as smoke, clouds and flame are not formed of entirely polished or globular atoms, because they can tear our organs. They can, for instance, make our eyes irritable. These are some interesting explanations. Brilliantly, Lucretius also explains evaporation. He writes, moreover, garments hung up on a wave-splashed shore eventually grow damp, and the same garments spread out in the sun eventually grow dry. Yet we do not see how the moisture has soaked them through, nor again how that moisture has withdrawn under the influence of heat. Therefore the moisture is sprayed out in the form of tiny particles, again atoms, that are completely invisible to our eyes. And this explanation holds up still. He then says that the sun and the wind enter into the water in the garment and unbind the ties that hold the atoms together, allowing them to evaporate into the air. A wonderful explanation. Lucretius also adds that light is composed of minute particles that hammer one another forward and under the impulsion of blows from behind, unhesitatingly pass through the intervening air. And indeed, although not entirely correct, light is made of particles, of photons we now know. But now his best example. We read, it is appropriate to examine with greater attention dust particles, the disorderly motion of which can be observed in rays of sunshine. Such chaotic motion attests to the underlying motion of matter, hidden and imperceptible. You will indeed observe numerous such particles shaken by invisible collisions, causing them to change path, be pushed back, retrace their steps, now here, now there, in all directions. It is clear that this to and fro motion is wholly due to atoms. And surprisingly, as we'll see in a later lecture, Einstein used exactly this type of random motion called Brownian motion to finally mathematically prove the existence of atoms. And thus unfolded the atomic theory of ancient Greece. In the next lecture we'll look at the parallel development of the atomic theory in India, with the main character here being Kanada, meaning the atom eater. But for now, I hope you were inspired. And if you want to learn more about Greek philosophy or any other topic from world history, then read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.